Gracious God, we gather as your people. And as we hear your word read and proclaimed, we pray that you would open our hearts, that we might be receptive to what you have to say to us this day. For we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Hearing Ron share about how he slammed the door on the car, and my guess is we've all done some similar kinds of things. I shared at the first service. This is a freebie. It's not part of the sermon. It's a story. It's an account, actually, I guess, if I remember correctly, I read, where there was a meeting going on, and one of the persons in the meeting didn't like what was going on, and things weren't going his way, and he got really angry, and he slammed his fist on the table, and he got up, and he stormed out. He slammed the door behind him. Everybody just kind of looked at one another. They weren't quite sure what to make of this or what was going to happen. I mean, they'd seen that kind of behavior coming from him before, but never quite to this extent. And then after a few seconds, there was a in his anger, he had not walked out of the room. He had walked into the closet, closing the door behind him. After doing so, the person chairing the committee meeting said, "Let's just wait and see what happens." As we look at what the church calls the 7 deadly sins, our first impression of them may be that, what's the big deal? They certainly don't look all that deadly. Granted, things like pride and envy and anger or lust or sloth, if we even know what that is except for an animal at the zoo, or gluttony or greed may not be the most admirable or endearing qualities in a person, but to call them deadly? Come on now. Really? Take what Jesus says in our gospel lesson for this morning. You've heard that it was said to those in ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. The prohibition against murder we can understand. After all, it's one of the Big Ten. 10 Commandments, Big Ten. Moses received from God on Mount Sinai. It wasn't very good, but so I will. It was carved in stone, literally. But to be told not to be angry, isn't that a little over the top? Maybe even a lot over the top? Jesus can't be serious, can he? Well, let's think about that for a minute. Now, you understand, when I say let's think about that for a minute, that's just a figure of speech. We're going to spend a little more time than just a minute thinking about it. Let's begin with thinking about this. Why can't Jesus be serious? Why can't Jesus be serious? Is it because we don't want him to be serious? Because even though we may have a clear conscience when it comes to actually murdering anybody, in our hearts we know we're as guilty as sin of being, or at least of having been, angry with any number of people. And not only will we confess to having been angry with others, more than likely we will also confess, if nobody else to ourselves, that we have harbored resentment, possibly even fantasized all kinds of unspeakable things happening to them. Is the reason Jesus can't be serious because to our enlightened way of reasoning, it is unreasonable, if not absurd, to think that being angry with somebody is as bad as actually murdering them? But remember what the prophet Isaiah says, speaking for God? Isaiah says, speaking for God, that my ways are not your ways, neither are my thoughts your thoughts, says the Lord. So let's just assume for a minute that Jesus really is serious. Let's assume that he is as serious as he can be. And wouldn't that then change the way we think of others? Wouldn't that change the way we talk about others? Wouldn't that then change the way we treat others? And wouldn't it have something to say about the grudges and the resentments that we carry around with us and nurse? Knowing how serious Jesus is about not being angry with others, wouldn't being reconciled with those with whom we are angry all of a sudden take on a greater sense of importance and urgency? I've had people tell me that they just can't forgive somebody for whatever it was they did to them or to someone they love. They just can't forgive them. When I hear that, my first thought is, you can't or you won't. The first may very well be an accurate assessment of what they think they're capable of doing. The second is a willful decision of what they intend to do or not do. I can understand when somebody genuinely means they can't, in the sense that they don't think they have what it takes. They don't think that they have within them what they need to do to be able to do something that difficult. But the truth of the matter is, the good news of the gospel is that even though we, in and of ourselves, by ourselves, on our own, may not think we have what it takes to do something like that, we can, as Paul reminds us in his letter to the Philippians, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. But if what they mean is that they won't forgive, well, then that's a whole nother matter altogether. To say that they won't forgive, that they refuse to forgive someone, raises some really serious questions that I suspect they more than likely have never thought of, let alone factored into the equation. For example, if they refuse to forgive, what do they do with that verse that's smack dab in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, where they ask to be forgiven? You know, the one that goes, forgive us our trespasses. How? As we forgive those who trespass against us. Seriously. I mean, what do they do with that verse? Do they really want God to forgive them as they forgive others? Do they really want God to forgive them the same way, to the same extent that they are willing to forgive others? Or do they just skip over that verse entirely and go on to the next one? Or have they even considered what the implications and the consequences of their decision not to forgive may be? Let's take it out of the realm of other people for a minute. Let's think about our own relationship with God. If we are unwilling to forgive somebody else, doesn't that become a deal breaker for us when we ask God to forgive us? Tradition has it that somebody came up to John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, and said, I never forgive. To which Wesley is reported to have said, then, sir, I hope you never sin. But does this mean we should never get angry? Obviously not. There are various times when Jesus got angry, especially with the hard-heartedness of the Pharisees. We read in the Old Testament where God got angry with the Israelites repeatedly. So, okay, when is it okay to be angry and when isn't it okay? Eugene Peterson and C.S. Lewis, two very good guides when it comes to living the spiritual life, have something to say about this that I think is really helpful. In his book Under the Unpredictable Plan, Eugene Peterson says this: anger is most useful as a diagnostic tool. When anger erupts within us, it's a signal that something is wrong. Something isn't working right. There's evil or incompetence or stupidity lurking about. Anger, Peterson says, is our sixth sense that something is wrong. It's our sixth sense for sniffing out what's wrong in the neighborhood. What anger fails to do, he says, is tell us whether the wrong is outside of us or inside of us. We usually begin by assuming that the wrong is outside of us. Our spouse or our child or God has done something wrong and we're angry. But when we track anger carefully, we often find it leads to a wrong within us. Wrong information, inadequate understanding, an undeveloped heart. Have you ever heard somebody say, maybe you've used this justification yourself, you lose it. I mean, you just lose it. And you look at somebody and you say, you make me so angry. Never said that? If so, listen to what C.S. Lewis has to say about it in his book, Mere Christianity. He's got a section that he calls Rats in the Cellar. Rats, R-A-T-S. Those cute little furry things that, you know. This is what C.S. Lewis says. We begin to notice, besides our particular sinful acts, our sinfulness. Begin to be alarmed not only about what we do, but about what we are. This may sound rather difficult, so I will try to make it clear from my own case, my own being Lewis's. When I come to my evening prayers and try to reckon up the sins of the day, 9 times out of 10, the most obvious one is some sin against charity. I have sulked or snapped or sneered or snubbed or stormed. But the excuse that immediately springs to my mind is that the provocation was so sudden and unexpected, I was caught off guard. I had not time to collect myself. Now, that may be an extenuating circumstance as regards those particular acts. They would obviously be worse if they had been deliberate or premeditated. On the other hand, surely what a man, or woman, but in his case, surely what a man does when he's taken off his guard is the best evidence for what sort of man he truly is. Surely what pops out before the man has time to put on a disguise is the truth. If there are rats in the cellar, you are most likely to see them when you go in very suddenly. But the suddenness does not create the rats. It only prevents them from hiding. In the same way, the suddenness of the provocation does not make me an ill-tempered man. It only shows me what an ill-tempered man I really am. The rats are always in the cellar. But if you go shouting and noisily, they will have taken cover before you switch the lights on. Rats, anger. More than likely, if we become angry, nobody has the power to make us angry. They simply reveal, bring to the surface what's already in us. Anger's part, though, of being human. God created us with the capacity to get angry. So the question then is, what arouses our anger? There are many. There are any number, I believe, any number of situations in life that should arouse our anger. Human trafficking, for example, or what we're doing to the environment, or war or injustice or child abuse, anything that mars, distorts, destroys the creation that God called good. But the second question is just as important, as not more so than the first. And that is what we do with our anger. Which is why I titled the sermon Caution, Explosive, Handle with Care. Because if we don't, if we're not careful, our anger can end up making things worse. It may end up as walking with a limp or maybe a broken toe, but it may be far worse than that. Let me suggest what we do with our anger is that we begin with a simple prayer. It's a prayer that comes from Psalm 51, and it goes like this. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. The simple part of that prayer is that it should be easy to remember. The not so easy part of the prayer is what we are asking God to do in us and through us. The reason we pray, create in me a clean heart, O God, is because as Jesus tells us, both in the Gospel of Matthew and as well as in the Gospel of Mark, it is out of the heart that come all kinds of evil things. This is how Matthew puts it. Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach, and out of the mouth goes into the stomach and into the sewer? What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. These are what defile, and they come from within. We pray that prayer. We pray that God would create within us a clean heart and instill within us a new and right spirit, so that we may become people who are slow to anger and quick to reconcile. So that we may be the kind of people who instinctively seek reconciliation instead of harboring resentments and grudges. I cannot remember the author of the quote, but I remember the quote. And it simply is that speak in anger and you will give the best speech you will ever regret. Speak in anger and you will give the best speech you ever regret. Now, we may not give a speech in the technical sense of addressing a large group of people with a prepared speech, but who of us hasn't said something at one time or another in our lives, and more than likely more often than we care to admit? Who of us hasn't said something or done something in anger that we regret? That we would give anything if we could just go back and undo it, because we would surely do it differently this time. When it comes to the 7 deadly sins, they may not look all that significant. They may not look all that deadly. We may wonder, what's the big deal? But if you have ever been caught in the crossfire of somebody's anger, or if somebody has experienced you, you know they are far more serious, perhaps far more deadly than we ever imagined. Would you pray with me, please? Oh God, we pray that you would be in our eyes and in all that we see. That you would be in our ears and in all that we hear. We pray that you would be in our hearts, so that what comes out